Stacy, ready to learn a new core study? This is Perry et al. Study that was done in 2015 by Dr. Anat Perry, and this one's about OT or oxytocin promoting closer interpersonal distance among highly empathetic individuals. And if you know anything about oxytocin, the OT that's being referred to here, oxytocin is also known as the cuddle drug, and it makes you kind of bond with your partner, it keeps you faithful to your partner. So OT is a very popular neurotransmitter, and it does a lot of, exciting things to the body and to behavior. So let's get started. So Dr. Anat Perry is a professor of psychology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and she studied empathy and social processes from a social cognitive neuroscientific perspective. And her research involved applying a range of different behaviors and biological research techniques to study how healthy and clinical populations behave. So they kind of pose this question out there. Imagine you have anxiety. How might it affect your interpersonal distance from others? And just to talk about interpersonal distance, think about interpersonal distance being like your personal space. How comfortable are you having people coming close to your private space, your little private bubble of space? And that's what they're referring to as interpersonal distance. If you're highly empathetic or maybe low on the scale of empathy, does that actually make you want people to be farther away from you or closer to you in proximity? So stuff to think about. So the social salience hypothesis of oxytocin, here's what they're talking about. When they're talking about oxytocin, they're talking about the effects of oxytocin on the human body. And these studies are really interesting because it shows that oxytocin, it modulates various aspects of social behaviors, such as empathy and trust, in-group preferencing, and even memories of social events. Oxytocin has a dark side too. Oxytocin encourages pro-social behaviors like hugging and bonding and being faithful to your partner. The effects of oxytocin are dependent also on context. Who's around you? Who are you living with? Are you in a relationship or not? So it's not just working alone, it's dependent on what's happening in your life. But here's the dark side of oxytocin. It might have some antisocial effects on the person. For example, when you're bonding with someone, right, think about them being unfaithful, people getting enraged with jealousy or being aggressive because they're jealous, right? So oxytocin can do that too. So oxytocin is a very interesting neurological factor that affects behavior in so many different ways. The study of proxemics isn't new. Edward T. Hall did a lot of studies regarding proximity, like interpersonal distance, and he studied here in the States. Remember that interpersonal distance varies from one culture to another. For example, people who are born and raised in South America, they might be closer to each other, like in proximity. They might hug more, kiss more. When they stand and talk to each other, they might stand closer together in proximity. And what's interesting is when you're coming from one culture and going to another, you feel it. It's like this unspoken rule. It's not written in any book, but still you know how far away you're supposed to stand when you talk to somebody. So sometimes when you're mixing with people from other cultures, right, they don't have the same kind of guidelines that you might feel as far as your culture with proximity. So they might stand a little too close to you and it feels uncomfortable. Like for us, especially as Americans, we value kind of like our private space, our personal distance. We don't let a lot of people into our intimate zone, called Edward T. Hall labeled our private space, our intimate zone. We don't let a lot of people in here. You have to really be close to me. You have to know me really well. We have to be really good friends for you to just come in and put your arm around me or stand really close to me or talk to me really close. So like, remember that when you go from one culture to another, those aspects of personal distance can change. And all of this is the study of proximity and personal distance. Remember that getting close to someone and getting farther away from someone has different meanings in different cultures. So keep that in mind as you study the Perry et al. So know what the word interpersonal distance means. And when you see the word salient, salient means notable or important. Remember that Perry was interested in the effects of oxytocin on people's preferred interpersonal distance, depending on if they have high empathy or low trait of empathy. Another key concept to know, of course, is what is OT, which is oxytocin. It's a social hormone that acts like a neurotransmitter. It plays a role in social bonding, childbirth, breastfeeding, promoting pro-social behavior, as well as approach behaviors, getting close to people. Another important key concept is what is the amygdala. The amygdala is a brain structure in the limbic system that sets off fight or flight. It's a brain structure that sparks this emergency mode. It also plays a role in interpersonal distance. Lesions or damages to the amygdala can lead to reduced need for interpersonal distance. So the more discomfort people feel with interpersonal distance, like they feel like too close feels uncomfortable or threatening, the higher the level of amygdala activity. So the amygdala is affected by oxytocin. It's increasing social interaction or interpersonal distance, and it might be reducing anxiety. So less oxytocin, more anxiety, and you're less social. In another related study by Shiel et al. In 2012, Shiel found that giving nasal oxytocin to males in monogamous relationships would increase their preferred interpersonal distance from an attractive female when in the presence of a female researcher compared to control conditions. So this is a little silly slide, kind of giving you the little synopsis on that story. Another key term to know in this study is the word empathy. It's understanding thoughts and feelings and experiences of another, and it's comprised of two different dimensions. You have cognitive empathy. Remember, cognitive means any and all mental elements. And then you have affective empathy. Remember, the word affect in psychology means like mood or feelings, right? So cognitive empathy is the ability to determine another person's emotional state. So when you look at your friend, you go, oh, are you sad? And you're usually right. That's cognitive empathy. But affective empathy is the ability to feel the emotional state of others. So when someone's like, your best friend comes over to you and you're like, oh, are you sad? You feel sad for them too. You feel their sadness. You feel their pain. That's the difference between cognitive empathy and affective empathy. So empathy and oxytocin, here's the theory. People who are highly empathetic would be more likely to prefer closer interpersonal distance following the OT nasal spray versus a placebo saline nasal spray. So low empathy people would prefer more distance between others, where high empathetic people would prefer less distance from others. So here's the question. How can you determine high or low empathy? Well, there's no blood test for that. And there's definitely, it's not an easy thing to assess by observation alone. You'd agree, right? So you have to find a quantifiable measure, some kind of, apparatus that measures this. Here comes the IRI. The IRI is Interpersonal Reactivity Index, and it's used to measure empathy levels, both cognitive empathy and affective empathy. This is how you can operationalize empathy. The IRI is a 28-item questionnaire. So high empathy is a score 40 or higher. Low empathy is a score 33 or under. This is a psychometric test. So check out over here, the IRI. Here are some questions from the IRI, and you should kind of get acquainted with some of the questions because you never know what AICE will ask you. They're very detailed about asking you questions. They might very well ask you what was one of the questions on the IRI. So get familiarized with the type of questions they are. Remember that they're answered on a 5-point Likert scale. Another very typical AICE question is they ask you what perspective or what assumption is linked to this particular study. So why is the Perry et al. Study linked to the assumption of the social approach? You have to know what the social approach is about. And remember, when they're looking at the social perspective in psychology, it's the study of not just you, the individual, but it's the study of you with perspective to others, right? People around you, to group settings, right? How you behave with people and how they, in turn, their behavior is changed by you too. That's the social approach of psychology. So you have to be able to link it to Perry. So remember, the link is it's including behaviors, cognitions, and emotions being affected by the presence of others and the social context which a person is in. So remember, the aim here for Perry et al. Is to investigate how oxytocin affects preferred interpersonal distance for those scoring high or low in empathy traits. Okay, so let's get into those details because you know very well AICE likes details and you have to know the nitty-gritty about the Perry et al. Study. So know your sample. So the sample is a volunteer sample. They had 54 male participants. They were all undergraduate students of the University of Haifa in Israel. The mean age was 25, but they were as young as 19 and they were as old as 32. They participated in exchange for course credit or payment. 5 were left-handed. All reported normal visual acuity and had no history of psychiatric or neurological disorders, and this was confirmed by a screened interview. Because our prior predictions regarding differential effects for individuals with high and low empathy, the participants were divided into those with high and low interpersonal reactivity indexes. So remember the IRI that they took that survey, they were separated into high and to low. So it created two groups, high interpersonal reactivity index and low interpersonal reactivity index. The participants were invited to come in twice, 1 week apart on the same day and time. Each participant signed an informed consent form. During each appointment, each participant was randomly administered either a solution of OT or saline solution if they were in the control group. That would be the placebo. Both solutions were self-administered in the presence of an experimenter by means of drops applied with a medicine dropper, 3 drops in each nostril. Now, this is a double-blind procedure. Remember what double-blind means? Neither the researcher or the participant knows who's in the experimental group or the control group. So remember what double-blind means. So neither one of them knows who has the OT or who has the placebo saline solution. No significant physical, local, or systemic side effects are observed with the OT or the saline solution. So after the solution was administered during their first appointment, they completed an online questionnaire. The IRI is that 28 item self-report. They did that. Then they waited for 45 minutes to have those OT levels be adjusted. During that waiting period, participants sat in a comfortable, quiet room and given 3 popular Israeli nature magazines just to keep them busy and also to keep any social interaction to a minimum. After about 45 minutes has elapsed, participants began the experiment. The order of the experiments were counterbalanced among the participants. So it's important that you know the procedure for experiment 1, which is the CID experiment, the comfortable interpersonal distance experiment. And this was a computer animated experiment in which the participant basically has to look at this computer and they're going to decide how close they want that protagonist. And the protagonist that they're talking about is either a close friend, a stranger, an authority figure, it could be like your boss or teacher, and a rolling ball. And they're supposed to look at the computer and imagine themselves in the center, and they press a space bar when they want the protagonist to stop. And this is the CID experiment. Read about the procedures and know the details. So here's an example of the CID experimental design where they have to look at the protagonist coming in towards the center, and the name of the protagonist is given to them. It's either a stranger, a friend, an authority figure, or a ball, and they're going to press the space bar when they want the protagonist to stop. In experiment 2, the participant has to choose a room. The participants were told that after participating in 2 runs of the experiment, where you have the OT and the placebo, they would be asked to sit in a room with another participant and discuss personal topics to be given to them at the time of the interaction. During the experiment, they would be shown a pair of very similar rooms for each trial, and they'd have to choose which room they preferred. They were told that this conversation would take place later and their preferences calculated and considered, and this actually never happened because the P's were debriefed afterward that this was kind of like a lie. They weren't going to have to be in a room with someone and talk about something personal. The stimuli used were colored pictures depicting rooms very similar to each other. Each had 2 identical chairs, a table, a plant, a closet, a lamp, and a clock. The rooms were created using Google SketchUp tools, and it makes it possible to model a room using real distances. And in each trial, the participant was shown 2 rooms simultaneously. So let's talk about the details of experiment 2. The 2 rooms, which are featured right above my head, you see the pictures? The 2 rooms differed on one of the following parameters: the distance between the chairs, the distance between the table and the plant, the angles of the chair positioning, and the angles of the positions of the table and the plant. The experiment included 21 different pairs of chair distances, 21 different pairs of table plant differences, and 3 options for each pair of angles, which were repeated 7 times to yield 21 pairs of comparative angles as well. Altogether, each participant was shown a total of 84 pairs, and each pair was repeated twice, yielding a total of 168 pairs. So here are some pictures of what the participant had to choose. They had to choose which distance between chairs and which angle of the chairs, and the angle of the table and the plant, and the distance between the table and the plant. So here are some pictures of the computer animated room. So in each trial and experiment 2, after about 0.5 seconds, looking at the fixation point, the participant was shown a pair of 2 rooms simultaneously. The 2 picture set was shown for about 2 seconds, followed by a screen asking the participant to choose the preferred room, the left one or the right. The pictures were displayed on a computer screen about 60 centimeters away from the participant's eyes. For each participant, an average preferred distance between chairs was computed, along with an average preferred table plant distance and the preferred angles for each of the furniture pairs. The distance and the angle between the chairs represent a potential distance from another individual in an intimate situation when you're discussing something personal. So they predicted that these measures would be affected by oxytocin, especially if they have high empathy. The theory was that if you had high empathy and oxytocin, that your preference would be a closer distance between people talking. Remember that they also theorized that if you had low empathy and you did not have the OT, it was like a, it was a saline solution or placebo, that it would be likely that you would choose a farther distance, like with that personal talk that you're thinking that you're going to have with this person, that you'd prefer more space. Okay, so remember, this is a repeated measure design because all the groups are doing the nasal spray condition both times. So, but it's going to be counterbalanced. To avoid order effects, the researcher is going to randomize whether they receive the OT or the placebo, the saline solution, during week 2. When the P's return, they got the alternative treatment. And remember, it's still double blind. The participant doesn't know if on week 1 they had the OT or they had the saline, and they don't know in week 2 if they had the OT or the saline. So it's completely randomized when they get it. And that's important because that's counterbalancing to avoid order effects. Remember, the independent variable, the IV, is the factor being manipulated or changed. And what is it? In this study, the IV is the self-administered nasal drops, whether it's OT or saline, right? If it's OT, that's the experimental group. And if it's the saline, it's going to be the control group. But nobody knows which one they're in. Another factor being manipulated and featured is, remember, the level of empathy, the results of the IRI, right? And so do they have low empathy or do they have high empathy? So remember that high empathy is 40 or higher and low empathy would be 33 or under. This is an independent measure design because the P's can only be in one group for empathy or like high group or low group depending on their IRI score. I love concept graphs. I made you some right here. Do you see them? Okay, so look at experiment 1. The IV in experiment 1 is the treatment, whether it's OT or the placebo, the saline, which is a repeated measure design. The IV2 in experiment 1 is empathy, high or low, depending on the IRI. And remember the condition, the stranger, the authority figure, the friend, and the ball. So those are another feature of the IV, and that's experiment 1 only. Now, if you look at experiment 2, IV1 could be the treatment, the OT or placebo, repeated measure design. The IV2 is the empathy, high or low, independent measure design. And remember the condition, the position of the chairs and the tables, and the 2 chairs together especially, because that's going to tell you about interpersonal relationships. Remember the plant and all those things are just kind of innocuous. So we talked about the IV. How about the DV? The DV, remember, is what you are measuring or the outcome, right? So in experiment 1, the DV or dependent variable is the preferred interpersonal distance measured using the CID, the comfortable interpersonal distance experiment on the computer. And it's on a 1 to 100 scale, 0 being touching and 100 being the farthest away. In experiment 2, the DV is choosing the room task where the P's indicate which room preference they want. And this is, of course, going to be the indicators how comfortable they are being closer to somebody or farther away. So AICE students, it's important that you know the results, really get a hold of some data, some quantitative data, the results of these experiments, because many times during the exam they'll ask you to talk about the results or the conclusion of an experiment, and they want you to drop some numbers, some quantitative data, so know something about each and every experiment that you study. So let's quickly sum up the results of experiment 2. High empathetic groups chose closer chairs in the OT group compared to the placebo. The opposite effect happened in low empathy groups, and OT had no effect on chair angle in high or low empathy conditions. So the conclusion is that OT affects preferred interpersonal distance or space dependent on the empathy level. So high empathy, closer distance, low empathy, farther distance. Okay, let's check the ethics of this experiment. They did have written consent from the beginning, check. They had the ethics approval by the committee of the university, check. OT is safe, no side effects, check. Saline solution is safe, no side effects, check. I guess the only problem here was that they did deceive the participants. Remember when they were told that they would have to discuss a personal topic alone in a room with someone, and how close do you want their chair? And that can make someone feel a little anxious, right? And so causing distress to a participant is unethical. A way to remedy this is by debriefing them afterwards and just make sure that the participant goes back, right, the way they came. That's the most important aspect of experimentation, right, in research. You want to make sure that the participant that you're using, right, in this experiment, that they leave the same way that they came, that they're no different, they're not altered in any way, and they're not distressed in any way. You have to kind of like put them back the way they were before you let them go again. AICE will often ask you, what is the strength of the study and what is the weakness of the study? Common questions, right? So when you think strength, instantly I want you to think of a lab. Well, it's a lab study, so there's going to be lots of controls, lots of standardizations, right? It's a computer-based test, so that's great. It can be replicated. It's going to be the same for everyone. So the CID is a valid way to determine distance preferences, and it's quantifiable, which is fantastic. It was also double blind, which is great too. It's the best way to do an experiment because it's going to minimize those biases. And they're using quantitative data. They're measuring distances, comparing scores. They're objectively allowing for statistical analysis. All of these are positives, and they're going to be on the side of strengths. Now, weaknesses, they only used male participants. They studied how females respond differently to OT. So they're not including females, which is going to make the generalizability kind of fall down a little bit. It's a computer-based lab setting, making it unrealistic, so it's going to be low in ecological validity. Also remember, they were self-reporting for the empathy test, and that can mean a lot of things. Remember the social desirability. Since they're self-reporting and they know people are looking at their data, they might not be truly honest in their assessment when they're taking these tests, questionnaires, etc. They also completed the IRI themselves, and again, social desirability can kick in. They know what the more popular answer is. Are they going to answer that because they think it's suitable? That's a problem, and that's going to be on the weak side. At the end of the study, you know it's good to fill in the grave. So as far as generalizability, we already talked about how there were only males, so the generalizability is going to be low. They didn't test any females, and let's face it, the age range, the lowest being 19, the highest being 32, the age ranges wasn't so expansive, so generalizability down. Now, reliability, replicability, high. It had a lot of controls, a lot of strict standardizations. Yes, this could be replicated. So that's definitely 2 thumbs up. Now, applicability is high because perhaps this can help us improve social behavior in males. What if we can apply this, OT and high and low empathy to people who want to, achieve closer relationships to others? Can this study or the use of OT in that nasal spray form or the nasal drop form, could it be used in other ways in society? It's very applicable, so thumbs up for applicability. And is it valid? Well, the CID is very valid in testing distance preferences. It's valid. It's a very valid way to measure. So the CID was really great. The IRI is really great in measuring empathy levels. So validity was definitely there. Are they testing what they're intending to test? And the answer is yes. Now, as far as the ethics is concerned, we covered this too. The ethics were generally positive. They had that one little, error in deception, but there's a way to remedy that we already talked about. So the ethics was pretty great too. So the only thing thumbs down was generalizability, and you know why. All right, you guys, so remember, study, and when you're practicing for the AICE exam and you're talking about Perry, write till your hand falls off. You're going to throw everything at them. Hopefully something sticks. And remember, that's the key to AICE. You want to write till your hand falls off. You want to tell them everything that you know, prove your knowledge, and earn that score.